My name is Linda Carter. I was married to Thomas for more than 30 years, and for most of that time, I thought I knew him better than anyone else in the world. He was steady, reliable, a man of routines. He ate the same breakfast every morning, wore his ties in a weekly rotation, and read the newspaper in the exact same order every single day. I used to joke that if you wound him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, he could run on autopilot until bedtime. That was Thomas. Predictable, dependable, safe. But on the night of his funeral, around 7:15 in the evening, his secretary placed a small ring of keys into my hand. I remember the cold bite of metal against my palm, the weight of them pressing down heavier than they should have. She said they were found in the back of his office safe. Nothing about her face gave away any meaning, but I felt it immediately. These weren't just ordinary keys. They were a doorway into a life I had never seen. For years, Thomas had warned me about a cabin up in Cedar Ridge. He called it his fishing spot, a quiet place with no phone service and no running water. A place he insisted I would hate. And I believed him, because why wouldn't I? A man like him didn't keep secrets. At least, that's what I told myself. But the moment those keys touched my hand, I knew I had a choice to make. Do I leave the past where it belongs? Or do I drive up that mountain and open the door he always told me to stay away from? I thought I was searching for betrayal. Instead, I was about to find an entirely different kind of truth. For 8 years, Thomas made the same trip on the third Saturday of every month. He would rise before dawn, pack his old duffel, kiss me on the forehead, and head out to Cedar Ridge for what he called his fishing days. I never questioned it. Truth be told, I enjoyed the quiet. Those Saturdays became my little retreats too, days when I could spread my quilting projects across the living room, eat ice cream for dinner without judgment, and watch my British mysteries without hearing him complain about unrealistic plot lines. Looking back, maybe that comfort was exactly why I didn't see the cracks forming. The first one appeared about 6 months before his heart attack. I was folding laundry when I lifted one of his fishing shirts to my face, and something felt wrong. It didn't smell like pine trees or lake water. It didn't even smell like sweat. It smelled of vanilla and lavender, the soft kind of scent you only notice when it doesn't belong. When I asked him about it later, he hardly looked up from his paper. He told me about a new bait shop, said everything there was scented. Fish attractants, he called them. It was so typically Thomas, reasonable, detailed, almost boring in its logic. I nodded, loaded the washer, and convinced myself I was overthinking. But then came the receipts, tucked away in his tackle box, of all places. Not for fishing gear, but from a little market in Cedar Ridge I had never heard of. Coffee beans, imported cheese, fresh flowers, bottles of wine. These weren't things you carried up a mountain alone to sit beside a creek. And yet, when I confronted him, he had an answer ready. He said a man got tired of gas station food, that the flowers were for my mother's grave on his way back. Again, everything sounded reasonable, and I let myself believe it. But I remember the way my stomach tightened, the way a small, unspoken fear began to live in me after that. What kind of life hides beneath explanations that always sound so perfect? And what happens when the answers no longer add up? The doubts I had buried came rushing back after Thomas's funeral. The keys weighed heavy in my pocket, and the receipts I had once dismissed echoed louder in my mind. Something inside me refused to rest until I had answers. So I called the cemetery office. My mother had been buried in Cedar Ridge, and Thomas often stopped there on his way home. I thought maybe someone could tell me if the flowers on those receipts really went where he said they did. The woman on the phone remembered him clearly. She said he came faithfully, month after month, always with fresh flowers. Her voice softened when she added that he never stopped at just my mother's grave. He always tended to the one right beside it too. A name I had never heard before clung to me like a stone. Rachel Pierce. A young woman, gone a decade, lying in the ground next to my mother. The woman spoke as though I should know her, as though it were obvious why my husband would bring flowers there too. I sat in the kitchen with the phone still in my hand, staring at the calendar on the wall. All those years of early mornings, long days, tired nights, suddenly they felt different. I tried to tell myself there was a reasonable explanation, but for the first time, I wasn't sure. Why Rachel? Why for so many years, and if flowers were the only secret? Why did he need a cabin hidden away in the mountains? The next Saturday, just after 6 o'clock in the morning, I drove up the winding road to Cedar Ridge. The sun was only beginning to slip through the trees, streaking the mountains with gold, and my heart beat like it was keeping time with every curve of the road. The keys rattled in the cup holder beside me. When I pulled into the clearing, the cabin stood waiting. Cedar siding weathered soft gray, a green metal roof shining faintly in the early light, and 2 rocking chairs on the porch that looked like they had been waiting for company. A pot of fresh chrysanthemums sat by the steps, still damp from the morning dew. My breath caught. This was not some rough fishing shack. This was a home. The lock turned easily, and the door gave with a low creak. The air inside carried a faint sweetness, as if someone had just left. Pale blue walls, yellow curtains, a quilt draped over the couch. Family photos lined the mantel, images of a dark-haired woman holding a baby, their smiles warm and unguarded. A vase of fresh flowers mirrored the ones outside. My hand rested on a picture frame. The back carried an inscription with names I didn't know: Rachel and Ava. The silence pressed in, and I felt the room almost whisper its truth. Thomas hadn't been escaping us. He had been keeping another world alive here. I stood in the middle of that cozy room, every memory of those fishing trips unraveling around me, and I realized I hadn't just opened a door. I had stepped into a life I never knew existed. I stayed frozen in that cabin, my eyes moving from one photograph to another. The woman in the pictures was young, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, her arms wrapped around a little girl who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3. The child had Thomas's eyes, soft, steady, and unmistakable. My knees nearly gave way as I sat on the couch. On the coffee table lay a leather-bound journal, its edges worn, the spine creased from years of use. I knew Thomas's handwriting the moment I saw it: strong, neat, deliberate. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first pages told a story I had never heard. Rachel Pierce was his daughter, long before he met me, back when he was barely out of high school. He had fathered a child in a relationship that fell apart before it ever had the chance to become a family. Rachel's mother had raised her alone. For decades, Thomas believed he had no place in her life. But 8 years ago, she reached out to him, and just like that, he became a father again, late in life. The entries shifted from cautious joy to heartbreak. Rachel had passed away suddenly only 3 years later, leaving behind her daughter. Ava. That little girl in the pictures, the one with his eyes, was his granddaughter. Month after month, Thomas drove up to Cedar Ridge not for solitude, but to keep his promise to a child. He paid the lease on the cabin so she would have a place filled with memories of her mother. He brought flowers, groceries, and small comforts. And when she visited with her aunt, he was there, quietly stepping into a role he had once lost the chance to play. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest. The anger I had carried, the suspicion of betrayal, the fear of another woman crumbled into something different. It wasn't unfaithfulness. It was fear. Fear of how I might react. Fear that I would feel betrayed by a past he couldn't change. Fear that I might not open my heart to the child he had vowed to protect. Sitting in that cabin, I realized something I didn't want to admit. He was probably right. If he had told me, would I have welcomed it, or would I have turned cold and distant, shutting down the only chance that child had for family? The truth wasn't what I expected, and yet it was heavier than anything I had prepared myself to carry. I was still sitting in that cabin, Thomas's journal open across my lap, when the sound of a car door slammed outside. My chest tightened. It was 11:30 in the morning, and instinct told me I wasn't supposed to be there. Through the thin curtains, I saw them, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a bun, and beside her, a young girl carrying a worn backpack. They moved with a kind of ease that only comes from belonging. This wasn't a place they were visiting. This was their space. The girl darted inside first, her small sneakers squeaking on the wood floor. She dropped her things in the corner like she had done it 100 times before. She hummed softly as she filled a glass at the sink, her movements practiced. She didn't notice me at first. I was standing there in silence, clutching the journal as though it might explain what I was doing in her world. Her name, I would learn, was Ava, the little girl from the photographs, Thomas's granddaughter. My granddaughter too, though she had no idea who I was. The older woman followed her aunt, Marjorie. She carried groceries and moved around the kitchen with the same comfort as if the walls had memorized her presence. A new carton of milk went in the fridge, fresh bread on the counter, flowers in a vase already waiting for them. I felt like an intruder in a home that held a piece of my husband's heart I had never been invited to see. And yet, watching that child laugh to herself as she unpacked crayons from her bag, I couldn't escape the truth. She was part of him, which meant, whether I was ready or not, she was part of me too. I slipped the journal into my purse, stepped back quietly, and knew the time had come for me to decide whether to turn away or step fully into a life I hadn't asked for, but one I could no longer ignore. That evening, after Margaret and Emma left the cabin, I sat alone in the quiet, surrounded by pieces of a life I hadn't known existed. Every photograph, every drawing on the fridge, every crayon left on the table whispered a truth I couldn't escape. Thomas had spent his final years balancing two lives, one with me, the wife who thought she knew him, and one with Emma, the granddaughter who had become his world. I found myself staring at the letter he had tucked away from me. His handwriting trembled across the page, apologizing for the years of secrecy. He admitted Rachel was his daughter, born long before he and I had ever met. He confessed that when she tracked him down, he couldn't turn her away. And when she died, leaving Emma behind, he couldn't abandon the little girl who carried his blood. I held that letter in my hands for a long time, the weight of his choices pressing down on me. He had not only hidden them from me, he had hidden me from them. Emma hadn't even known I existed. That truth hurt more than I wanted to admit. But beneath the hurt was something deeper, something I couldn't push away. Emma's future was hanging in the balance. Thomas had been her anchor, and now that anchor was gone. Margaret was strong, but she was aging. The money Thomas had provided was gone too. I could have walked away. I could have left the cabin, shut the door, and chosen the simple widow's life people expected me to live. But every time I pictured Emma's face, every time I thought about the way she tended to her mother's flowers with such care, I knew it wasn't that simple. Thomas had carried this secret because he was afraid I wouldn't accept it. And maybe, at one time, he was right. But standing in that cabin, I realized I had been given a choice he no longer had. Would I see this as betrayal, or would I see it as inheritance, the responsibility to protect a child who had already lost too much? The following weeks unfolded like a test I hadn't studied for. Margaret and I spoke more often, and every conversation circled back to Emma. I could hear the strain in Margaret's voice. She loved that child fiercely, but age and circumstance were pressing hard against her. And then there was Emma herself, wide-eyed and watchful, carrying more loss in her small frame than most adults I knew. I remember the first time Emma asked me if I would come back to the cabin. She didn't say it as a demand, but as a fragile hope, as if she had already prepared herself for disappointment. That moment broke me. I realized then how many times she must have been let down, how quickly children who lose too much learn not to trust promises. So I went back, not once, but again and again. At first, I kept my distance, unsure of what role I had the right to claim. But Emma had a way of drawing me in, showing me her reading nook, the games she and Thomas used to play, the little rituals they had shared. With every visit, she handed me pieces of her world, testing to see if I would hold them carefully or let them slip. I started to bring small things with me: books, art supplies, photo albums of Thomas from years before she was born. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw her grandfather as a boy, grinning with a fish nearly as big as him. She told me she looked just like him in that picture, and she was right. Somewhere between those visits, I felt something shift. I had walked into that cabin expecting betrayal. Instead, I had stumbled into an invitation to step into a role I never thought I would have. I had never been a mother, not for lack of wanting, but for reasons life had never explained. And yet, here was this child who looked at me with cautious hope, silently asking if I might be her grandmother. And deep down, I knew I wanted to say yes. It was during one of those quiet afternoons at the cabin when Emma asked me the question that shook me to my core. She wanted to know if I was going to stay in her life forever or just until I got tired of her. She didn't ask it with drama or tears. She asked it the way a child asks about the weather, calm and almost casual, but I could feel the weight of it pressing against her little heart. That moment told me everything I needed to know about her world. She had already learned that adults can walk away. She had already learned that love doesn't always stay. And here she was, looking to me for something permanent, something she could hold on to without fear it would be taken away. I realized then that Thomas's secret was never really about deception. It was about courage, the kind he struggled to find while he was alive, the kind he hoped someone else might carry forward after he was gone. I went home that evening and sat in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the stack of papers Thomas had left behind. Insurance, bank records, bills, all the things he had managed so carefully. And then I thought of Emma, clutching her little stuffed rabbit, trying to be brave while silently begging not to be abandoned again. That was when it became clear to me. I couldn't just visit when it was convenient. I couldn't just provide money and call it enough. If I was going to honor Thomas's memory and, more importantly, if I was going to give Emma what she truly needed, I had to step into the role fully. Not as a visitor, not as an outsider, but as her grandmother. It terrified me. I was nearly 70. I had planned for quiet years filled with gardens, book clubs, and quiet mornings. Instead, I was staring at the possibility of raising a child who had already endured more loss than most adults ever face. But love doesn't always show up the way we expect. Sometimes it demands that we be braver than we ever thought we could be. And as frightening as that was, I knew deep down that I wanted to answer that call. 6 months after I first turned that key in the cabin door, everything in my life looked different. Emma's shoes were lined up by my front door. Her schoolwork spread across the kitchen table most evenings. Her laughter, sometimes her tears, filled the rooms that had once been so quiet. The guardianship process was long, filled with paperwork, home visits, and questions that cut into my confidence. Could I, at nearly 70, truly provide the life Emma needed every step of the way? I wrestled with doubts, but every time Emma slipped her hand into mine, every time she leaned against me with the trust of a child who finally believed she wasn't going to be left behind again, the answer became clearer. When the judge signed the papers making it official, Emma looked up at me with wide eyes, as if she was waiting for confirmation that this wasn't another promise that could break. I pulled her close and whispered the truth I had come to carry with me. I wasn't going anywhere. Life since then has been anything but simple. There are mornings when I feel the weight of my age more than ever. There are nights when I question whether I'm doing enough, whether I'm getting it right. But then, I see Emma curled up on the couch, her stuffed rabbit still tucked under her arm, her world slowly stitching itself back together. And I realize that love doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for presence. I thought Thomas's secret would destroy me. Instead, it gave me a gift I never expected: a granddaughter who has taught me that family isn't always the one you plan, but the one you choose to show up for. Looking back, I see that Thomas's biggest mistake wasn't in loving Emma. It was in underestimating me. He didn't trust that I could carry this with him. But now, I carry it for both of us. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: sometimes the hardest doors to open lead us to the love we didn't even know we were missing. So, I'll leave you with this: if you've ever found yourself standing at the edge of a choice that scares you, ask yourself what love requires of you. And if this story moved you, I'd love for you to share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and your stories matter too.